My name is Hillary Stevens. I am the Coastal Resilience Manager here at Restore America's Estuaries, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar about lessons learned at developing blue carbon market projects. We have two wonderful guests today here from the Nature Conservancy to talk about their experience. Let me first introduce Restore America's Estuaries. We are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We are an alliance of 10 member organizations that you see here based around the country. We serve as a convener and an advocate for these organizations that are working to support their local bays and estuaries. And indeed, we serve to support all coastal professionals working to protect their resources. This webinar series is focused on coastal blue carbon, which refers to the greenhouse gases that are stored in and sequestered by coastal marine ecosystems, including seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. And if you're interested in more information about blue carbon, I can refer you to our website, which the URL is here, estuaries.org/bluecarbon. You're also welcome to sign up for our monthly newsletter, the Blue Carbon Buzz, which includes references to ongoing events, recent news, and professional research articles. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers. We will be hearing from Stefanie Simpson and Nikki Rovner of the Nature Conservancy. Steph Simpson is the Coastal Wetland Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's global teams. She supports TNC's regional programs to develop climate finance market mechanisms that support coastal wetland restoration and conservation. Prior to TNC, Steph worked for the EPA's Office of Water, Restore America's Estuaries, and South Carolina's ACE Basin NER. Nikki Rovner is Associate State Director at the Nature Conservancy in Virginia, where she advances the group's mission of conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends by fostering partnerships with agencies, organizations, and decision makers. Nikki served as Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources in the administration of Governor Tim Kaine of Virginia between 2006 and 2010. She began her career as a staff attorney with the Virginia Division of Legislative Services. We have a very warm welcome to both of them. And before I pass the baton, I want to give a little bit of background to the topics that they're going to be talking about. Towards the beginning of this year, in February of 2020, we released a report discussing legal issues on public land regarding blue carbon projects, which was authored by Reed Porter of the Marine Affairs Institute at the Roger Williams Law School. He looked into a number of the challenges that face these types of projects going on in public lands, and there are two broad categories. One of them is title and property rights. As you are probably aware, the boundaries between different properties can be very complex in the coastal zone, where public lands and private lands begin and end. They're different from one state to the next and can be fluid over time as well. If the shoreline is advancing or retreating, and as sea level rise advances, those boundaries can change. And so when you're looking at a project like a carbon verification project that requires over a long time frame, this can be very complicated. Many carbon projects require looking at a 100-year time frame, and when you're trying to factor in sea level rise and some of these other issues, it becomes extremely complicated. There are also issues of legal authority. Many agencies lack mandates that would give them specific permission and to include these kind of projects. While it is not necessarily inconsistent with mandates such as conservation of natural resources and preserving them for future generations, they do not have a specific mandate to work in these kinds of projects. And so many property managers working in public agencies are reluctant to get involved in something until they have that very specific authority. Additionally, carbon credits are transferable rights with monetary value. And if they do not have a mandate to transfer those credits outside of that public agency, again, they may feel very reluctant or entirely unable to do that. I am not an attorney. I don't want to get too far into this. I can refer you to the document that these are based on, and Nikki will be speaking with more expertise on some of these issues in just a few minutes. Some of the recommendations that Reed Porter gave based on that report are at the outset of a project to identify all public and private property owners that will be impacted, not just at the present time, but throughout the period of record, which might be 100 years. In other words, if the ownership or any of the rights that go along with ownership might change over time, make sure you're factoring that in and that you have contact with all of the stakeholders that will be involved. Make sure that you determine what method you will use to transfer the carbon rights, if they will need to be going directly from an agency to another body, if there is a nonprofit that might be involved. Some agencies have an associated nonprofit. Make sure that you understand that trail of ownership and that it is legal and mandated. Look at the time limits involved. Again, as I said, a number of the verification standards require a 100-year planning horizon, and make sure that that is taken into account in terms of the property ownership and what might happen with sea level rise and other issues. A lot of the research that was done in this is looking at federal issues, but of course, in many of these projects, we are looking at local and state legal concerns as well, and often looking at state-owned land. And again, Steph and Nikki will be talking more about this. So in addition to looking at federal concerns, you also need to look at local, state, and site-specific legal concerns that will be relevant to the project. So again, if you want more information about these issues and the recommendations that he makes, I refer you to our website where the entire document is available for you to read, and a webinar that Reed Porter gave back in April has been recorded and posted, so you can get some background information there. And there is my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me directly. Also, if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please feel free to enter them in the question box on the right side of your screen. And at the end of the talks, I will take those and read them out to our presenters, and they will have an opportunity to address that. If we are not able to get to all of the questions, please feel free to follow up with me directly or to either of our speakers, and you should get their contact information later on. So with that, let me pass this over to Steph.
Great, thanks, Hillary. And can I just get a confirmation that you can see my slides here?
Yes, absolutely, you're good to go.
Great, thanks. So thanks for the introduction. I'm glad to be here with you and to be accompanied by my colleague, Nikki Rovner. As Hillary mentioned, I'm with the Nature Conservancy's global teams, and Nikki is with our Virginia State chapter. And we're excited to be able to share some lessons that we've learned in developing blue carbon offset projects today. So I won't go into too much detail since Hillary gave a great introduction already about what is blue carbon, or what we're referring to as blue carbon. But just a reminder, since I know this term is used in various marine and ocean habitats, that these are the three that we'll be referring to today when we talk about blue carbon. And the reason being is because we have the scientific knowledge of how much carbon, how significant the carbon pools are beneath these systems, and understanding of the greenhouse fluxes within them, and more importantly, I think also how our human activities can influence the carbon storage and also carbon being emitted from these systems. So we know particularly what distinguishes these coastal systems from their terrestrial counterparts in carbon storage is that the majority of this carbon is being stored within the soils. And this is a really important distinguishing aspect because it also impacts what type of project activities we might be looking for climate mitigation benefits. So why the interest in blue carbon? Of course, there's a lot of different reasons to increase our understanding of this climate mitigation benefit that coastal wetlands provide, and understanding additional value that our restoration and protection efforts provide as an opportunity to link tidal wetlands into developing climate mitigation policies and as additional metric for ecosystem health. But one approach that we'll be talking about today is how to access market incentives. There's a growing interest and demand for carbon offsets, and this is a great way to connect to new partners to help support the conservation and restoration of these systems. There's a large market out there for carbon offsets, and you've probably heard in the news in the last year or so, there's increasing interest specifically for offsets from natural climate solutions. And so historically, the terrestrial forests have really benefited a lot from these carbon offsets and the payment of over $2 billion since the early 2000s. So our reasoning or rationale in pursuing blue carbon offsets is really to get a piece of this carbon finance pie to help support our coastal wetlands. I won't go into too much detail of the carbon market so I can get to some of our lessons learned as we have been developing pilot projects, but I did want to provide this quick overview and a few terms to note. One, and that a carbon offset, I'll use that a lot throughout the presentation, but we're not just measuring carbon in these systems, we do take into account methane and nitrous oxide. Those are measured within these projects, but they're then converted to tons of CO2 equivalents for ease of measuring. So when I talk about a carbon offset, I'm also talking about other carbon or greenhouse gas emissions and capture and storage as well. So I'm also going to be referring mostly to the voluntary carbon market today because it's the most accessible market across the globe. We do have a couple of emerging regulated markets in the US, like the California Cap and Trade Scheme and internationally. But because that's not accessible everywhere and the voluntary carbon market is, that's where our efforts have been thus far in piloting blue carbon offsets. And so who is managing these type of offset projects? This is really overseen by carbon standards. These are a few examples on the screen. One that I'll be making note of today is the verified carbon standard, which is under VERA, the VERA program. They're the largest issuer of land use offsets and a standard that we work with for developing our blue carbon offsets. So these standards are the ones that set the methodology requirements, the greenhouse gas procedures, and they're the ones who approve new methodologies for use that generate carbon offsets. So over the past 6 or 7 years, we've really seen a lot of development and a lot of enabling conditions that are allowing us for the first time to generate blue carbon offsets on the voluntary carbon market. The first of which is the approval of methodologies. Prior to 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't have approved methodologies for coastal wetland activities to generate carbon offsets. And now we do. We have quite a few methodologies, which I'll be mentioning in a moment. We also have a better understanding of the greenhouse gas benefits within these systems, with papers coming out just about on a monthly basis, increasing our knowledge, increasing data access to understanding this climate mitigation benefit, and connecting that benefit to how we manage, how we restore, how we can protect these systems. And we have more and more capacity on the ground to develop these projects. As I'll be talking about, this is really important to developing a blue carbon offset project, that you have capacity on the ground level to initiate these projects, to collect data, and to engage with their surrounding community. So first, a note on the methodologies. There's a number of methodologies available for carbon offsets, for blue carbon offsets. I'll specifically call out the last two listed here, which is the Global Tidal Wetland and Seagrass Restoration Methodology, which was approved by the Verified Carbon Standard, and more recently, a REDD+ methodology framework that was revised to include the conservation of coastal wetland habitats that was also approved by the Verified Carbon Standard. And I'm specifically mentioning these two methodologies because they are widely applicable on a global scale to a variety of restoration and protection activities, making these kind of projects accessible no matter where you are in the world to help you develop a carbon offset project. So what type of activities can result in a climate mitigation benefit? Now, not every restoration or protection project is going to be right for a blue carbon offset project. You really want to identify those projects where you expect to have significant climate mitigation benefits. So here's some of the kind of low-hanging fruit, as it were, project activities to look out for. The first and foremost would be habitat protection. We want to protect that existing habitat before all of those benefits are lost. And specifically when it comes to climate mitigation, these habitats are sitting on tops of large stores of carbon. And so where we can prevent the release of that carbon, that can result in significant carbon offsets. In terms of restoration, where we're looking for ongoing or planned restoration, I would say the first kind of priority activity that I would look out for would be reconnection of impounded waters. And by impounded waters, I'm referring to those coastal wetlands that historically had tidal connection and were saline. But over the years, some impediment has resulted in a limitation or complete cutoff of tidal flow. In many cases, we see this as infrastructure, a bridge or a road that was built across the system, resulting in the wetland behind it becoming fresh. And as freshwater wetlands tend to emit methane, they can then be a source of greenhouse gases. So a restoration activity that would involve the reconnection of that wetland, that impounded wetland, to tidal flow, and resulting in increase in salinity, would pretty much cut off those methane emissions. And because, again, methane is a stronger global warming potential, and we're measuring carbon offsets and CO2 equivalents, methane reductions result in immediate and significant carbon dioxide benefits, or could generate a number of carbon offsets. And now those projects do tend to be, of course, larger in scope and cost, so that's something to consider. Next is the rewetting of drained organic soils. So where we have those drained soils, that's where we can have release of that stored organic soil back into the atmosphere. And that carbon loss can happen relatively quickly compared to the rate at which it was captured over time. So an activity in which we're rewetting that soil and revegetating that area is going to also likely to result in significant climate benefits. I've added this last point here because as we are looking for project, potential project sites, I would reiterate, at least for our approach, we're looking for where there's already ongoing or planned restoration. And this is really because we want to leverage where work is already happening and bring additional resources to these projects, where we know many of them, most of them, are having their own challenges with lack of resources and especially long-term funding, which is where climate finance can come in to support these projects long-term. And in the case of the voluntary carbon market and with the verified carbon standard, we can establish a project start date 5 years prior to today. So that gives us an opportunity to leverage ongoing restoration to start generating credits in the more near term. So what does the carbon project cycle look like? So here's just a high-level overview of the carbon project cycle, starting with project siting, then feasibility, project description, and a monitoring report, which must be validated and verified by an independent third party. After that verification process, then credits can be issued, and you can sell those credits on the voluntary carbon market. But I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes really talking about this first and most critical step of feasibility assessment, where we really understand, is a project feasible to develop blue carbon offsets? So I'll first note that a feasibility study is a gathering of existing data to help inform a market decision. So we're not necessarily going out to gather new carbon data, but we want to look what data is already available and then put that data in the context of developing a carbon market project. That means looking at voluntary and regulatory market options, looking at what data is available, not just carbon sequestration, but emission factors and sea level rise projections. And then taking that data, using it to model out offset projections. There's 4 different graphs here on the screen to show you what some of those different scenarios can look like. So really you're trying to determine what a baseline scenario is, say what's the greenhouse gas fluxes currently without interventions, and then what that with project scenario is with your restoration or protection activities. And then what is that net benefit in between? Next, we're also looking at a financial analysis in this feasibility stage, looking at the cost benefit of market project development, because of course there is cost to developing a carbon market project, and contractual cost, data gathering, and validation verification cost as well. So we want to make sure that it's going to be worthwhile to develop this carbon market project, that it will generate carbon revenues on the other end that can support this project long term. There's also legal and landowner issues to talk about, which we'll get into a little bit more, and Nikki will also get into a case study that we've been working on in Virginia. It's also opportunity to look at different organizational partnerships for a project. What are the different partners involved? What are the roles and responsibilities that they would play? And then finally, we also like to include a landscape analysis within these feasibility studies. We may be looking at a couple of different identified sites, but this is a great opportunity also to look across a landscape using GIS to look at maybe other opportunities to include additional land area into a project. So we've been working through this feasibility at a number of different project sites, and even beyond feasibility, working towards generating carbon offsets at a site in Virginia. So sharing some of the challenges that we've come across so far and opportunities to address those challenges. First, as probably no surprise, is funding. Funding needed to cover the upfront cost to cover feasibility and carbon project development. I've mentioned some of those documents like project description and monitoring report, and also the validation and verification process, which does, of course, require additional cost. But here I think there is a great opportunity because this is a new and innovative approach to conservation finance. And there's a lot of co-benefits to these projects. They're not just capturing carbon, they're also increasing resilience to coastal communities, reducing flooding, providing key fisheries habitat and water quality. So there's a lot of demand out there, not just for natural climate solutions, but for those projects that investors can purchase offsets from and then tout all of those co-benefits that these projects are providing. So that's a real opportunity here to connect with this niche field of blue carbon offsets and attracting those partners who are specific or particularly interested in those coastal environmental projects to support. There's also an opportunity through grant funding, which we've also seen some success in as well, and early project adopters to help support some of those upfront costs for feasibility and project development. The next challenge I'll note is establishing baselines, particularly for conservation projects. So if you have a conservation or avoided loss project, you have to establish a declining baseline over at least 10 years. And this can be a challenge to show that there truly is a threat and that we can quantify what that threat looks like over the next 10 years. The opportunities here are that we have more and more satellite imagery available, more and more existing MRV at project sites that we can tap into. One approach that we've also been using for our project in Belize is to look at what permits, development permits have been applied for, what are existing or future development plans as well, and can we overlay that with habitat to kind of to show where a threat might be and what that threat looks like over time. So there's a lot of flexibility within the methodologies for demonstrating this threat, but it does need to be grounded in science to show that an avoided loss project really is avoiding loss of that habitat over time. Then another challenge is scale. Of course, these coastal wetland projects are happening at a much smaller scale than their terrestrial counterparts are. And so justifying some of that upfront cost is really important to also be able to find a scale in a project. Fortunately, the standards like the Verified Carbon Standard do allow for project grouping. So this is another great opportunity to group together several project sites within a jurisdiction or across a set of project activities like salt marsh restoration, for example, where you could group together that project, outlining a larger project area to allow for restoration as it happens over time to be included within a single project. This can help streamline some of this project cost, as that upfront cost for feasibility and project development and monitoring reports, validation are all relatively fixed. So the larger project area you can determine up front is going to help really get those economies of scale for project development. And the last challenge I'll mention is legal. understanding and addressing those landowner rights. And Hillary gave a great background on this, that there's a need to really understand what the landowner's rights are to participate in the market, and more importantly, that they have that right to transfer the carbon rights as the carbon offsets are generated and sold. This is a little bit more straightforward when working with private landowners and less so with public landowners. But we've had a great case study in Virginia, and Nikki's been our advocate and our leader in working through some of these legal issues there. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to her to talk a little bit more about this and share information and approaches that were used in our Virginia project. Nikki?
Okay, Steph, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. So this is my one and only slide, and I'm going to talk about this for maybe 10 minutes or less. And I'm going to tell you the story of legislation that we got enacted in Virginia at the beginning of this year, which of course seems like 20 years ago, because we were able to do this in person. So the first thing that I want to do is I just want to walk you through the legislation, because it's actually pretty short. It's 4 sentences and it's right here. And then I'm going to tell you the story of all the players who were involved in getting this done. So the first sentence says the department may participate in any carbon market for which submerged aquatic vegetation restoration, qualifies as an activity that generates carbon offset credits. So what is the department? Well, actually, it's the Department of Environmental Quality, but as I will tell you in our story, that wasn't our original idea. It was important to get that authority, and I'll say more about how we knew that. We did not know about the paper that Hillary mentioned, because that didn't come out until February. So we had to have some legal research done back last fall. The Virginia legislature, I should say, meets at the beginning of the year. They meet in January and February. So that's when we worked on this legislation. The second sentence says that any revenue from the sale of credits will be used for additional monitoring and research of SAB, or to cover the administrative costs of participation in the credit market, and there are costs, as Stefanie discussed. The third sentence says that the department can enter into agreements when necessary to effect such participation, including with private entities for assistance with registration and sale of offset credits. And that's really important, because that's what the Nature Conservancy is going to do. It's going to work with the state to put together this project. In fact, that is what we are doing right now. And so we had to make sure that this authority that was being given to the state agency included the ability to work with us, because they don't have extra capacity lying around to create a carbon project. They are very much strapped, and so they need our help. And so that's why we had to make sure that was in there. And then the last sentence is the department shall hold exclusive title to such credits until sold. So the department could not transfer the credits to us and let us sell them. This is something that belongs to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it has to belong to the Commonwealth of Virginia until they decide to transfer the credits. So that's what the legislation says. I guess I should back up and say something that perhaps you've already figured out, but I'm not sure either one of us actually said, and that is our blue carbon project in Virginia is an eelgrass restoration project. It's submerged aquatic vegetation. These two pictures are one of my colleague on the Eastern Shore, Bo, who's in charge of the project, and the other is of an academic partner at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, who's pioneered this work, frankly. And so that's why this particular legislation speaks to SAV and not wetlands. Okay, that's one reason. And the other reason, of course, is because it is the Commonwealth that owns the subaqueous bottom, right? So let me tell you the little story of how we decided we needed this legislation and how we got it passed. It seemed fairly clear to us that the Virginia Marine Resources Commission was going to be the agency that would be the participant in the carbon market, because, as I said, VMRC manages the bottom. The Commonwealth, that is the state of Virginia, is the owner of the subaqueous bottom, right? But it's the Virginia Marine Resources Commission is the specific agency that manages the bottom, issues leases, manages public oyster harvest, all of that. So we went to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, which was very well aware of our eelgrass project, and had supported it and understood it very well and knew exactly where it was occurring. We said we would like to see if it would be possible to generate credits from the eelgrass restoration project. And because you manage the bottom, we think you'd probably have to be the owner, and you would have to sell the credits. Do you think you can do that? And they said, we don't know. Because they, they've never been asked this question before, right? This is a completely novel idea for them. And they were certainly willing to help us explore it, but they really didn't feel like they knew if they had the authority to do it. So based on that answer, we had a couple of questions, we had a couple of options as to where we could go to get an answer to the question.
Nikki, I think we've lost your connection. If you might try turning off your camera and see if that helps your bandwidth.
Did you miss out on some of what I just said?
Yeah, we lost you for about 2 minutes there.
Oh boy. What was I talking about when you lost me?
You're mentioning the state not knowing what this next steps were going to be to be involved.
Okay, so we had three choices of who to ask this question of. Does VMRC have the authority to do this? And the choices were a private law firm, the Attorney General's office, and an academic institution. And we knew it would take a long time to get an answer from the Attorney General's office. They have a lot to do. Also, we appreciate their capacity constraints. And also, they tend to be pretty conservative in advising agencies about their authority. And we also didn't want to pay a law firm. And also, even if we got an opinion from a law firm that said VMRC had authority to do this, we didn't know if that would be persuasive to them. Again, because they want to feel comfortable that they can do what we're asking them to do. So we decided to go with the Virginia Coastal Policy Center, which is this great institution at William & Mary Law School, where law students work with faculty to answer policy and legal questions just like this. And we also knew that the Virginia Coastal Policy Center would understand the science involved, because that's part of what they do, the science involved in blue carbon and also eelgrass restoration. So that's who we went to, and they were incredibly helpful. They did it on sort of a short timeline that we needed, because we needed to know this before the legislative session in case we had to go and look for we had to go and seek legislation. The two students at the Coastal Policy Center wrote this paper for us. It's on their website. You can find it just by searching for blue carbon. You can also just ask me if you email me. I'd be happy to send you the paper. And their conclusion was not terribly surprising, also based on what turned out to be the later paper that was done at the behest of RAE. Their conclusion was, VMRC could probably do this. There's an argument to be made that they could do it, but it would be a lot safer if you actually went to the General Assembly and made sure that there was explicit authority. So that's what we did. We went to the legislature with a proposal, and the proponent of the legislation, the sponsor, was Senator Linwood Lewis. And it was very obvious who we should ask to sponsor this legislation, because Senator Lewis represents the area where this eelgrass restoration project is happening, the eastern shore of Virginia. And he's also a leader in coastal resilience and in climate change. He was, in fact, the sponsor of the bill that also passed in 2020, under which Virginia is joining RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I'm sure you all know is the cap and trade program in the Northeast states. So he was very happy to sponsor this legislation, and it was a lot of work for him, so we're really appreciative of that. We did not think it would be controversial. And it turns out it was not controversial, but that does not mean it was easy to get it passed. First of all, the shellfish growers were interested in this legislation, and that wasn't terribly surprising because we knew that shellfish growers on the Eastern Shore have some concerns about the potential for submerged aquatic vegetation to invade their to spread into their operations, and that causes a conflict. It hasn't happened a lot. It has happened some. The Virginia Marine Resources Commission likes to protect the eelgrass bed, but they will also grandfather in existing growers when they've already been operating and eelgrass has moved into their beds. The shellfish growers want to make sure that this new blue carbon idea wasn't going to cause more restoration that would invade their shellfish beds even more. And so that second sentence in the legislation there that says revenue can be used for monitoring and research. When we introduced the bill, it actually said further restoration, monitoring, and research. And the shellfish growers asked us if we would remove the word restoration for that reason. And it seemed like a fairly small thing to give up. This is a huge eelgrass project, but it is not a huge blue carbon project from the standpoint of generating a ton of carbon credits that are going to be worth an enormous amount of money. And so we didn't feel like we were losing a lot. We could easily use up the revenue, right, with monitoring and research and administrative costs of participation in the credit market. So we did not, we felt like that was an easy concession, and the shellfish growers agreed to support the legislation, or at least not oppose it when we did that. So that was one obstacle we overcame. The second was that the Virginia Secretary of Natural Resources, who is very supportive of eelgrass restoration and blue carbon, nevertheless had some concerns because he was working to stand up a new climate change program at the Department of Environmental Quality. And at one point, he said to us, gee, I wonder if you could wait a year on this so that I can get this program established at DEQ. And we said, gee, we really don't want to do that. And the reason is, as Steph said, you can go back 5 years for your blue carbon project. And it turns out that 2015 was a really big year for eelgrass restoration on the Eastern Shore. So we did not want to do that. And we went back and forth with the secretary, who really did want to help us. And what we agreed was, what he suggested and we ultimately agreed was, instead of asking VMRC to be the carbon market participant, we would ask DEQ to do it so that it could be part of their emerging climate change program. And, you know, we're the Nature Conservancy. We work with agencies all the time, and we like all of them. So we were happy to work with DEQ in addition to VMRC. VMRC still has to be involved, of course, because they still manage the bottom. And I'll just end with that. That's where our project stands from a policy standpoint, as we're working right now on agreement with the two agencies, DEQ and VMRC, to move this forward. So that is the story of our legislation, and I will turn it back to Steph.
Great, thanks so much, Nikki. It's been a great process working with the state on this project. And so I'll give just a little bit more update to this project. As Nikki said, we're still working on formalizing those agreements and working on working with the agencies. So at this point in the project cycle, this is about where we are, where we have these documents created, just trying to finalize a few more things before we start them into the validation and verification process. But our hope is to have some blue carbon offset credits generated definitely, hopefully within the next year or so, or in the next year, earlier rather than later. It's a very iterative process that we're learning along the way. But we are really excited. This pilot project has given us a lot of opportunities for learning and for sharing that learning with you today, and hopefully more lessons to come. So before we finish up and pass it and hopefully open up to some questions here, I want to share some of the other places that we're working to pilot these blue carbon methodologies. So Virginia, of course, this is our farthest along project and development, but we're also working in Belize, looking at mangrove protection, in the Bahamas at scoping out where blue carbon offsets could be generated to support mangrove and seagrass restoration and conservation. And then more in the earlier stages in China and New Zealand as well. So we're really trying to come up with a a wide geographic scope, and including a wide variety of wetland activities as well. So pilot this approach, learn from them, and also share that so that other project developers can get these projects up off the ground as well. So the big takeaways to leave you all with today, very important to have supportive team on the ground. Nikki is a great example of that. Her and the rest of our Virginia Coastal Reserve team and our partners on the ground there, including VIMS and the State DEQ and VMRC and the University of Virginia and so many others have been just so critical to getting this project off the ground. So I can't reiterate enough how important it is to have a supportive team and those strong partnerships. And also having established MRV. One of the reasons why that Virginia project has proved to be a great piloting location is because of the research that's already been ongoing through the partnership with the state and with VIMS and the ongoing seagrass restoration that's been happening there as well. And of course, having effective government liaisons and political will is also really important to this process, as hopefully you took note also while Nikki was telling the story of our Virginia project development there. So of course, as you can probably tell, these projects take a lot more to develop them. It's not as simple as coming up with some estimates and generating greenhouse gases. They do take a lot of effort to get them off the ground, which means they take a longer term view of planning. These projects, at least under the verified carbon standard, require at least a project minimum of 20 years. And so that means having longer landowner commitments and financial planning and taking into effect things like sea level rise and other climate hazards over the years. But I think that this ultimately is a great opportunity, requiring this bigger and longer picture for wetland restoration and conservation, because it's resulting in projects that can be sustained over the long term. Carbon revenues can provide much needed finance in the long term to help support project management and monitoring, typically very underfunded project components that are also very critical to not just the ecosystem's success, but also the community that depends on these ecosystems and the services they provide. So that's the big takeaway for me as we've been working to develop these carbon offset projects, is it really enforces that longer term viewpoint, and it was really great for bringing a diverse array of stakeholders together in support of these projects. So with that, I think I'll pass it back to Hillary to try to fit in as many questions as we can. Thank you for having Nikki and I today.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating talk, and I think very helpful to folks in our audience who are coming in from around the country and some international as well. So I'm going to dive right into the questions here and try and squeeze in as many as we can. First, from Ed, and this came in during the first part of your talk, Steph, so this is aimed at you. Can you clarify the 5-year allowable time frame under the VCS for ongoing restoration at the potential project site? Would the same level of verification and monitoring be required for any pre-project credits sought?
I'll try to understand the question's getting at. So looking at that 5-year, we can go back and establish a project start date of 5-year. So I think the answer is yes. I mean, you would have to come up with your monitoring plan. So in our case, we looked at what monitoring approach was already being used for this project site, which is being led, monitoring is largely being led by VIMS and our TNC VCR staff. And with a lot of support from the UVA coastal or carbon program as well. So those all went into our monitoring plan. So your monitoring plan is set out within the project description and monitoring report, and that does have to be verified by an independent third party. But if you already have these existing projects going on, you already have your MRV approaches, it's not a big lift to then integrate them within carbon project development, really aligning the two together. I hope that answers your question, Ed. Feel free to email me if it didn't.
Thank you. And speaking of following up email, we get this from Sonagitu. Thank you for the insightful presentation. Please kindly advise how Cross River State in Nigeria can start a blue carbon project via your support. So I'm going to email you this person's contact, and you can follow up, because I suspect there's going to need to be a few links in that chain.
Right.
Daniel asks, do you plan to roll this out in other states, and which states are you prioritizing?
Yes, we'd love to develop other projects in other states. Right now, we've been working mostly within our TNC chapters. Working with our Texas chapter, other chapters in the Gulf. And we've had discussions with honestly many of our coastal chapters. As you may know, TNC has a chapter in every state in the U.S., which gives us a great opportunity to kind of look at the landscape of what's happening. As I mentioned kind of previously, we're really looking for where there's already planned or ongoing restoration or protection activities, leveraging those to add in the carbon project development aspect. So if you have project sites that you're interested in, I'd love to hear from you and help you kind of think about if a carbon project might be a good fit.
Great. From Sylvia, do you have a sense of how much the Virginia eelgrass restoration project could generate in terms of dollars? And I'm assuming that's what value of the carbon credits.
Right. That's a great question. One we're not quite ready to talk about yet. We're still in this negotiating, and as you can probably imagine, it's it's a sensitive area where we have not very many credits. These are small projects and a lot of interest. So we are working this out. We want to get the best value. These projects provide a lot of value, and not just the carbon mitigation benefits, but all the other co-benefits that are being provided. So we do work with, we will work with potential purchasers to value these projects accordingly and at above average carbon prices, because we know that they're worth a lot, and that the finances support is as critically important for their success long term as well.
Related, John asks, will the carbon price change, or can it be set at it says at the time of purchase, and I'm wondering if that means at the time of the completion of the project.
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this is a very iterative process, so it really depends on who your purchaser is and the agreement set up. So I think ideally, yes, we would look to set up an initial price and an increasing price over time, recognizing increasing value from the project. But that is, it's all set up in those agreements with purchasers ahead of time.
Okay, I'm just going to keep plowing through because the questions are pouring in. Janine wants to know, have you seen other projects around the world where using any offsets has also been limited, similarly to the Virginia project, to not be used for restoration?
That's a great question. I'm actually not sure. The only other project I know that have sold credits, specifically blue carbon, were mangrove blue carbon offset projects, and a project in Africa, I believe in Madagascar or Kenya, if I might be recalling incorrectly. But the revenues were actually they're used for community support, for support in our schools and education materials. So that's also, it really depends on the project. These are very site specific, and I think that's another important thing to note, that you want to have that community engagement and understanding what are the community needs, what are the project needs, and taking that into account into what the revenue could and should go towards.
Are you familiar with similar project and legislation activities in other states? For example, Maryland and Puerto Rico.
I'm not familiar with any specifics right now. I think, Massachusetts was looking at some of this and developing climate policies and how coastal wetlands could be included. California, their cap and trade program actually, so while they do allow for carbon offsets in the California cap and trade program, wetland restoration is not currently an approved category. We do tend to see this in regulated markets, that they first look for project success on the voluntary market before they adopt new project categories, which is another reason to be piloting these projects on the voluntary carbon market, so that they can then be adopted into the regulatory market, where prices tend to go for a higher price, or offsets tend to go for a higher price. But interestingly, as part of the California Climate Investment Program, where what their plan for the carbon revenues, or how they use carbon revenues from the sale of allowances, is part of that is going towards wetland restoration, and wetland restoration that results in positive in climate mitigation, and meeting climate mitigation goals. So there's some $40+ million so far that have gone from the sale of carbon allowances in California to support wetland restoration. So I think that's a great example of how blue carbon has been incorporated into state policies in a very kind of innovative way to support wetlands.
Melissa asks, is there a minimum acreage for restoration that makes a project eligible for offsets? Can smaller restoration projects be batched with other small projects? And I think you did mention this. I'm wondering if you have any examples or advice about how to go about doing this.
Right, so that's an excellent question. It's probably one of the number ones I get on these type of presentations, and unfortunately it's not easy to answer. I will say, of course, the larger project area is going to be better, but it really depends on the project type. So I mentioned projects that reduce methane emissions. If you're reducing methane emissions, you could probably get away with a smaller project area. But if you're reducing carbon dioxide emissions or restoring through vegetation or replantings only, you would probably need a larger project area. But there is that opportunity to group together smaller project areas to achieve the necessary scale to justify a project. I would say it's safe to aim for 1,000 acres if you can get up that. At least for a few hundred acres. You know, those kind of 10-acre sites, which I know is fairly common with these projects, is going to be very difficult to get to the right scale to justify a carbon project development. So I would definitely suggest aiming towards hundreds, and if you can get to 1,000 acres by grouping together smaller project activities, I think that would be your best bet.
I've got a couple of people asking about what happens if the project fails. In other words, if the credits are sold, but then some natural event, a hurricane or something else happens and the eelgrass dies off.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a risk assessment that is done as part of the project description and monitoring report, and those results are again validated and verified by independent third party. So, for example, in the case of the eelgrass, some of the risks that have been taken into account are things like sea level rise and the rate at which that's happening compared to the rate at which the sediment is accumulating and growing. Thankfully, it's a very resilient system in the bay where we're working. Species, eating, consuming seagrass, that's a smaller risk that was also included within our risk assessment. And of course, any risk of storms. So all of that is included within our risk assessment. There's a tool that the standard provides to walk you through that. You come up with basically a percentage based on that risk. Of offsets that would go towards a buffer pool, and this is required for all land use projects. So VCS holds on to those offsets in their buffer pool. So if there is an instance of reversal, a storm comes in, or say something like that, you would go out, quantify how many offsets have been reversed, and then those offsets would be basically balanced out by offsets from that buffer pool, so that any sold are still good for the greenhouse gas reductions that they promised.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Juliet asked, do you trade the carbon expected to be accumulated over a set number of years? And once those years have passed, can you assume the meadow is continuing to accrue carbon and trade a new set of offsets?
So I think the question is getting more towards offset vintage. So first, to clarify, every offset must be good for 100 years. And that's a part of the methodology and the validation verification procedures to assure that there's permanence to these projects. But as far as when those offsets are issued, the vintage, what we refer to there is as that kind of date or time when it was issued. We do see, older vintages tend to go for less prices or less, a lower price at times. I would say right now, looking at the market, there's a huge demand for natural climate solutions, and we don't have a big supply of those type of offsets. So I think we're going to see that become less of an issue. At least that's my That's my hypothesis, and that's also something you can work out as part of the upfront agreement with investors, the price at which they're willing to pay for different vintages as well.
Okay, with that, I want to keep an eye on the time. I want to thank you so much, and I think we'll wrap it there. Nikki, Stefanie, thank you so much for your time and expertise. This has really been a fascinating talk, and I thank you for your patience to take all of these questions. I want to encourage everyone, if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact me, or Steph and Nikki's contact info should still be on your screen. The recording for this webinar will be available posted on the RAY website under the Blue Carbon Resources section. That should be up within the next couple of days, and you'll get the URL in a follow-up email. Again, please feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions. Stay tuned to our webinar for, to our newsletter for information about future webinars. And we do hope to see Stefanie and Nikki here again in the future as this Virginia project progresses, because we can't wait to hear what happens next. So thank you again so much for your time, and we'll wish you a very happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you.